Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Steele, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people here at UBC campus. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about doing research with Indigenous peoples in a good way, and this lecture will cover the Sharma and colleagues paper from week 7 of the syllabus. So what's the CEDAR project? The CEDAR project is a project run here at UBC by faculty in the School of Population and Public Health, along with a number of collaborators at the University of Northern BC and a number of Indigenous elders who've worked in a leadership role on this project. And it's focused on HIV and hepatitis C among Indigenous people who use drugs in Prince George and in Vancouver. And the article describes a number of key components. There's sort of a long list. I'll summarize them into 4 components here. So one is the strength-based. It focuses on the strengths of study participants while acknowledging their trauma, and that's contrasted with deficit-based approaches, which we'll discuss in a bit. In addition, there's a strong component of ethics. In some ways, ethics runs through every aspect of this project, but one of the key ideas of ethics in this project is the idea of accountability to Indigenous communities. So that means that, for example, the results of the studies have to be expected to produce some benefit to those communities who are being studied. Indigenous governance, this is a major feature of the CEDAR project. So the project is led by a partnership with Indigenous elders, and the elders are sort of the key decision makers in deciding the general research questions and what topics are going to be addressed. And secondly, there's finally multiple perspectives of elders, partners, students, the academics, professors from UBC who work on the project, and other professors, and the staff, and all of these different perspectives can contribute in different ways, but the Indigenous voice, and especially the voice of the elders, is privileged in those discussions. So there's two issues that I want to focus on in this lecture that come from this paper. I think there's many other topics you could draw out of it, but the ones that I'm going to focus on are deficit-based research and how this approach of the CEDAR project avoids that, and also accountability. So let's start with deficit-based research and how not to do that. So first of all, what is deficit-based research? Well, deficit-based research essentially works by comparing a group, usually a historically marginalized or discriminated against group in society, to the sort of broader society, so the broader population averages on some health outcome, and then pointing out that this marginalized group does less well. Let's say that the lifespan in the marginalized group isn't as long, or that there's higher rates of disease, and so on. And what makes deficit-based research kind of distinctive is it does this without really talking about the context that's behind that, without discussing things like structural injustices, maybe racism or colonialism, that's tied to why these disparities exist. And doing research in this way is ethically problematic because it can really encourage negative stereotypes about groups of people who are already on the receiving end of a lot of discrimination. So one question then is what to do about that, how to avoid this kind of research, how not to do this deficit-based research. One response is simply not to study disparities at all. One reaction would simply to say, don't do any kind of study that, say, compares, Indigenous people to any other group of people. However, that seems to be a little problematic in certain ways itself as well. So, for instance, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action 19 says that we should identify and close gaps in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. And clearly that implies that there's going to be some studies identifying those gaps, right? And without that, how could you identify the gaps without studying health disparities between, say, Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups? So that suggests that some level of study of and research on disparities is necessary. And in fact, the CEDAR project did involve some studies that that found, that looked at such statistics. So for instance, in the reading, there was a reference to a 2017 study as part of the CEDAR project that found that Indigenous people who use drugs were 13 times more likely to die than Canadians their age. But notice a key difference is that this study linked this disparity to colonization. So it wasn't simply, here's this difference between Indigenous health outcomes and health outcomes in the broader population and leaving it at that. It's connecting that to this background. So let's dive into that idea in just a bit more detail. So you can think about sort of two ways to avoid deficit-based research. So one is that you do study disparities, but you study those disparities within the context of structural injustices that give rise to them. And one of the things I think that's important here is it's not simply enough just to simply mention the context, not just to simply mention, colonization might have something to do with this. The study should really dive into that in some serious way in terms of its analysis. For example, by measuring variables in the study that are related to, say, colonialism. An example of this that's mentioned in the reading is a study that looked at hepatitis C and whether the participants' parents had been in residential schools. And the idea was that the study found statistically that among the Indigenous participants in the study, if their parents had been in a residential school, their children were more likely to have hepatitis C. And so notice that this isn't simply saying colonization is related in some vague way, but actually studying and building into the research design a way to draw that connection. Another way to avoid deficit-based research is to identify factors that promote resilience among the marginalized groups. So to promote and essentially healthier outcomes. And this is often called strength-based research or strength-based approaches. And the CEDAR project included a number of studies like this as well. So for example, the reading mentions a 2015 study that found that traditional culture and language were associated with higher resilience and with better health outcomes. And so notice that in each of these types of studies, what's going on is that it's being made clear that Indigenous identity itself is not some kind of risk factor for poor health. It's rather there are things like colonialism that are in different ways are risks for poor health, and that there are aspects of Indigenous culture that are positive predictors and positive factors for health. Okay, so let's turn to accountability. Here the idea is responsibility to the broader community that goes beyond standard research ethics. And this is, again, a key feature of the CEDAR project. And in the reading, Sharma and colleagues distinguish Western research ethics from what they, sort of in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, call NDN ethics. And so Western research ethics is focused on safety of the research participants, quality of the research, and also protection of the research institution, the university or the hospital from lawsuits. So there's often a very sort of making sure everybody follows the rules so that whoever is sort of the host of the research can't get in trouble further down the line. However, there isn't often, in many cases, a big emphasis on making sure that research is beneficial to whoever it is that's being studied. And that's one of the big differences with NDN ethics, as it's called in the paper. Here the idea is that there's a big emphasis on the safety of the research participants, of course, but also accountability to the research participants' communities. And that includes considerations about how the research results are communicated. So in the paper, it discusses how research results were discussed by Indigenous elders in the leadership team of CEDAR, and there was a discussion of how these would be communicated with the media before it was just sort of before it went out there, and also to make sure that these results were used in ways that would benefit the communities that the research was studying. So, to take away from all this, I'd like to summarize sort of two main points that I think that are interesting to take away from this article. And again, I think there are more interesting ethical issues that you can find in this paper and that we can discuss in class. But the first is there's more than one way to avoid deficit-based research. So studying disparities, but with a clear emphasis on the context of the structural injustice, where that structural injustice is one of the things that's in your study, and you're measuring and studying specific ways in which that structural injustice, like colonialism, is related to the health disparities. That's one way to avoid deficit-based research. And strength-based research is another. And examples of both of this kind of research can be found in the CEDAR project. A second is this key point of accountability to communities. And again, this comes up in a number of different ways, making sure that the results are used in ways that support policies or interventions that benefit communities, making sure the results are communicated in ways that they won't be sort of misinterpreted or used to sort of support stereotypes, but will get the intended idea across. And also this involves sort of as is described in the readings, Indigenous oversight on research design and planning of the project. So again, CEDAR raises many other fascinating ethical issues, but I think that's enough for now. And we'll talk about this more in class. Okay, bye-bye and see you soon.